Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm your host of this session of Cut the Crop. And today we're talking to FAR Senior Environment Researcher Abie Horrocks. Welcome, Abie.
Thanks, Alison.
Yeah, and we're talking about maize nutrition. So obviously there's a lot of maize having been planted over the last couple of weeks, and nitrogen is a key nutrient required for optimum productivity. And so we're going to talk about, I guess, the value of soil available nitrogen in addition to the added nitrogen through synthetic fertiliser. So let's just talk about the advantages of making sure that you are aware of what nitrogen there is in the soil and how you can access it.
Right. So to optimise maize yield, nitrogen is key. So we're all on the same page there. And I guess there's a bit of discussion going around about, well, how much of that nitrogen should come from the soil compared to from applied N or from the bag. And in most instances, there will need to be applied N from the bag. This is perhaps not if you've come putting your maize in after a long-term pasture, and we know that enough soil can be mineralised from that long-term pasture to meet all of the requirements of a maize crop. Or if, for example, you've had a legume in over the winter, that can go a long way to meet your maize in requirements as well. But it really comes down to soil testing to make sure you get that right. And in most instances, if the maize is going into a long-term cropping sort of situation, then there'll be less soil in available and more will be required to meet those target yields. But the reason why, to answer your question, we want to be factoring that soil in is it's essentially economic and environmental. I'll talk probably a bit about this term mineralization. So this is a microbially driven process where the soil microbes are chasing energy from soil organic matter, from primarily carbon, and they will release some plant available N when they do this. So they will be busy mineralizing this soil organic matter, releasing this plant available N. And once it's in that plant available N form, it's really mobile. So if we don't factor it in to our fertiliser decisions, then, the saying is if you don't use it, you lose it, then it's likely to become more of an environmental risk. We can talk a bit about that as well. So I think the main reason why we want to factor in that soil N into the fert decisions is because fertiliser N is expensive and there's an opportunity to save money, and in some instances quite a lot of money in those maize systems. So I would say that's the primary reason, but of course that environmental part of the conversation is really important too.
Yeah. So we have been conducting a maize system trial comparing two different nitrogen fertiliser strategies. Tell us about that.
Yes. So we need to be really clear that if we're going to be using that soil N, it's not going to compromise your yields or the quality of your maize or your soil organic matter forming processes. So to do that, we need to show the numbers, do the trials. And Dirk Wallace and the North Island team is managing a trial which started in 2021. So it's in its third year, and basically it's just trying to quantify that just so we can provide that reassurance to growers what it looks like when you do factor in that soil N. So the trial does look at two different winter crops, a woolly pod vetch legume alongside the annual ryegrass. I'm just going to focus today in today's chat around the annual ryegrass silage rotation with the two nitrogen treatments. One is one that factors in soil N and then adds the additional N required to meet those target yields from the bag, compared to a treatment that just ignores the soil N and just puts it all in from applied N. And so, that trial's been going on since 2021.
Yeah. So before we talk about the results of that, what tools do you have to use in order to be able to know what your soil N is?
Yes. Okay. So That's a very good question. The tools are about doing the soil testing. So I've mentioned some of those benefits of factoring in soil into your decision making. It does require effort, like everything. There's trade-offs. You've got to get out there and do the soil testing. And there is also the next question, what the heck do you do with the numbers that come back from the lab? So this is where you're using the soil calculators to crunch those numbers. We have an end calculator on our website where once you put in what your target yields are, so we know how much nitrogen the maize requires to reach those target yields, then you can plug in the numbers you get back from the lab. And that might just be your mineral N, which is a test of the nitrogen available at that day of sampling, but you can also go one step further and measure that potentially mineralizable N to get a sense of how much will be released over the growing season if you really want to fine tune your fertilizer decision making. So it's actually really easy to check those numbers into the calculator, and then it will tell you how much you can get from the soil reserves, soil N, and how much fertilizer you need to meet those target yields. I will say one thing about those calculators, that like anything, they are easy to use once you know how. So my message to farmers interested in exploring the space is to pick up the phone, give us a call, get someone or talk to someone who's used it, so you can get familiar with how they work, because it can seem a little bit overwhelming when you get your concentrations from the lab, but you actually want to convert them into kilograms of nitrogen per hectare so you can really get a sense of how much nitrogen that soil will be providing. So, yeah.
So we've had two strategies. We've had one which is just putting on enough nitrogen that the crop needs versus putting on nitrogen but taking into account the soil N. So what were the results? I mean, if we just look at productivity, like yield and quality, were there any major differences?
No. So there was no yield or quality differences between those two treatments, the treatment that takes into account soil N and the one that doesn't. And as a consequence of that, we saw greater profitability from the good management practice treatments. So it's been going for 3 years now. Roughly on average, it's been about $200 per hectare, increased profitability where that soil N is factored in. So over those 3 seasons, that same result has occurred. So it's around $600 per hectare across those 3 seasons. And that's essentially because you're putting less fertiliser on and the yields are not being compromised.
What about the environmental side, like nitrate leaching and greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes, so nitrate leaching, the way that we haven't measured leaching per se, but what we do measure is residual N. So that is the amount of nitrogen that's left in the system after the maize harvest. And this is when you're going into winter, when you have the drainage events. And as I said before, once that nitrogen is in that plant available form, it is very mobile. And if you've got a lot of N sitting there going into winter, then that's, I guess, a proxy for the risk of leaching. So we saw significantly greater risk of nitrate leaching from the treatment that didn't factor in soil N. There's essentially more N unutilised sitting there going into more of a high-risk part of the season. I said I wasn't going to mention the vetch, but I do want to point out that the highest risk actually came from when the winter crop was a legume, and when the nitrogen generated from that legume wasn't factored in to the fertiliser decision, the risk of leaching for that subsequent winter was very high indeed. So it's especially important to use these tools to factor in that soil N if you've got legumes in the system to capitalise on that N and to reduce that leaching risk. Greenhouse gases, did you want me to mention them? And again, the greenhouse gas emission numbers were a lot lower from the treatment that took into account soil N. For example, the 22-23 year, it was about a 38% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions associated with that reduction in fertiliser use, which, and you can break that down into the scope 1, 2, and 3 for those that are interested. Great reductions in the scope 1 emissions, which are associated with the greenhouse gas emissions from applying the fertiliser, but also the scope 2 and 3, which are tied in with the production of the fertiliser, the emissions associated with the storage and the transport. Yeah. And you could take that conversation into the dairy, supporting the dairy sectors' goals to reduce their Scope 3 emissions with their imported feed. So it's an important conversation, but you could have a whole podcast about that.
That's right. So what about any changes in soil carbon or organic matter?
Yes, so that's also an important thing to keep an eye on. We've been measuring organic matter and carbon over the 3 years because the yields haven't differed between those two treatments. It's not surprising that there hasn't been no detectable differences in soil organic matter, and so we'll continue to watch those numbers over time.
How long is the trial going on for?
It's a long-term trial, so the intention is to carry it on. I'm not exactly sure how long we will keep it running, but we do want to build up that long-term story about changing nitrogen fertiliser use, so we get a really good picture of what that where everything lands over a longer period of time.
Yeah. Now, I mean, what about the risk of mining the soil? I mean, people have raised this as, a risk associated with taking into account sort of soil available in. Mm-hmm. How do you make sure that you don't end up mining the soil too much?
Yes. So farmers are often asking that question, what are the consequences of using soil in? Does that mean you're mining your soil? My answer to that is, in cropping systems, it's the carbon that tends to be limited. So if you go from a pastoral perennial system to a cropping, your soil organic matter goes down because you've got annual crops, you've got periods where crops aren't growing, and you don't have those above and below ground returns. So it is something we need to be really mindful of in a cropping sector. If we insist on using that word mining, then it should be associated with the challenges we have around soil organic matter to maintain those. Maintain that in really intensive rotations where there's a lot of removal of biomass. So utilising soil available in, I think it's important to say that those microbes are mineralising that soil organic matter regardless of how much fertiliser goes on. They're doing it to get their energy needs. And once it's in that plant available form, if it's not going to go up, it's going to go down. So it's not so much that it's mining the soil, it's just utilising that nitrogen that would otherwise be lost, turning it into protein and contributing to the yield. So I think it can be misleading to think about in terms of mining the soil, even though nitrogen is important for soil organic matter building. We're in systems where it's the carbon that's limiting, not the nitrogen.
Yeah. Okay. So when's the best time for growers to sort of do all of this work to identify what their soil in is?
Yes. So in a maize system, that will depend if you are putting all your nitrogen on as starter. If that was in those instances, then you'd want to do your soil testing and to give you enough time to get the results back, chuck them into the calculator and make your fertiliser decision. So before the maize is planted, we know that maize doesn't start utilising nitrogen for 4 to 6 weeks after it's planted. So ideally, more of that nitrogen would go on as a side dressing, so you can just target it, have more efficiency. And if that's the case, then you would recommend soil sampling closer to that side dressing. And in terms of depth and how to sample, in most instances there'll be support to do that soil sampling. Depth is an interesting one. The lower you go, the more you know. You can the maize roots go down a long way. They can utilise nitrogen from quite far down the profile. But if you're just going to measure to 15 centimetres, that's better than nothing. It still gives you a sense of the nitrogen that can be contributed from the soil. Just know that that will be underestimating your nitrogen supply. But ideally, you will just try and target that soil testing quite just prior to the main fertiliser application time to give yourself enough time to get the results back and to crunch those numbers with the tools that are available.
Yeah. So if a grower's listening to this and they say, well, I really want to start doing that, what do they do to begin with? Are there good resources out there for them?
Yes and no. In some areas, there will be less resources and support available to do that soil testing. In those instances, then you can do it yourself. You could order a soil sampler from Hills Lab For example, you could even use the Quick N test to do the soil nitrogen sampling yourself. There's a lot of information on that on our website, or again, just you can pick up the phone and chat with us around how to use the Quick N. So if you're lacking support in your local area, then you can do it yourself. Otherwise, getting in a rep to do that soil sampling, sending the results back to the lab, getting them back, chucking them into the calculator. There's a feature in our N calculator where you can put in how the percentage that you want to rely on the soil N to crunch your fertiliser N requirement. So if you're someone that is just starting out, you might err on the side of caution and just say, I want my fertiliser decision to only factor in 30% of what the soil tests tell me will become available. Someone who's more experienced and has figured it out a bit more down the path, they might up that percentage. So the calculator is quite good in that regard. It can, I think, step you through how confident you are in using or factoring in that soil into your decision making. But in terms of support, if you can't access someone directly to do the soil sampling, then do it yourself. You can actually do it yourself as well.
Yeah. So I mean, you've said that it, using this strategy, which we think of as good management practice, doesn't negatively impact on yield or quality, but it reduces input costs, and so makes it more profitable, and it's got some environmental benefits. So you would imagine that most growers would want to do this. What portion of the industry is actually doing this at the moment?
If you're talking about the maize systems, I would suggest that there is a lot of opportunity to do this more. I'm not saying it's not happening. I just see an opportunity to factor this into decision making so that you can get those benefits. I see it as an area that could be utilised more. And part of my reasons for saying that is sometimes you get to field days and you see how much residual N is left over in maize systems, and sometimes it can be quite jaw-dropping with how much nitrogen is still sitting there in the system, which is indicative of opportunities to tighten up those fertiliser decisions and to save that money. But I think, like anything, it's a bit of a mindset shift. There is a sense of reassurance, I think, that comes from just going, okay, this is how much nitrogen I need, and making sure you put it on from the bag, so that there's this, I guess, a sense of the unknown of relying on something like the below ground supplies. And I think the more that farmers start utilising these tools, doing the testing, and seeing that they can maintain their yields and save money, then they'll progress to building that confidence and to factoring that in a bit more standard practice. But like anything, it takes, I think it just takes a bit of practicing it on your own farm, seeing what results you get, finding out where your sweet spot is. Every farm was going to be a bit different. These tools are only there to support you. Yeah. So you need to apply your own common sense, and support from other farmers in your region is always a really great place to start to build up a bit of a toolkit.
Yeah, excellent. And hence the reason for this podcast, of course, to just promote the fact that there is management strategies out there that can give you those improvements. So any final words of wisdom? My
final words of wisdom will be, I think, just pick up the phone and give us a call if this is something that you would like to explore more. But when you plug into the website and look at the calculator and it just seems a bit overwhelming, I think get someone just to talk you through it, and that's they can go a really long way in it just becoming the next step. It's not overwhelming.
Thank you, Abie, and thank you, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.